That's the fascinating thing to me about this bill is wonderful for China if you want U.S. manufacturing and energy production to retreat and China to just have complete dominance in the world in terms of advanced energy production, vehicle and battery manufacturing. The U.S. is going to lose. Alaska, you could say, is collateral damage in that process. A Chinese foreign agent couldn't have done a better job writing a bill to disempower America than the budget reconciliation bill that passed the House.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Alaska State House Representative for Downtown Anchorage, Zack Fields. He is here to explain the budget reconciliation bill recently passed in the U.S. House by a single vote. That bill is now in the Senate, where, if it is not substantially amended, would adversely affect Alaska in many ways. The first of which is by cutting funding for SNAP, which is the federal food stamp program. About 70,000 Alaskans receive SNAP benefits. The bill would also significantly affect Medicaid, which is government health insurance for low-income people and families. About 250,000 Alaskans are currently enrolled in Medicaid. The bill offers significant tax cuts that primarily benefit the ultra-wealthy. Ultimately, if the 2025 budget reconciliation passes as is, it would massively increase the federal deficit, which is already alarmingly high and has contributed to a reduction in America's credit rating. Zack Fields, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Andrew. Good to see you.
So you were on the podcast last year. We talked about your life. We talked about union work, lots of other interesting things. So if that's what you're looking for, that's the Zack Fields podcast episode to listen to. This one, we are going to be talking about Congress in DC. So this bill, the budget reconciliation bill, which is essentially providing the federal budget for the coming year.
Here's the important thing to understand about the federal government. Washington, D.C. is so broken that Congress only passes two bills these days. They pass the National Defense Authorization Act and they pass budget reconciliation. And every other major policy will be rolled in there. So this is a, quote, budget bill. But what else does it do? It eliminates long-standing tech-neutral tax credits for things like hydropower. Good luck developing energy independence in the state of Alaska if this bill passes as written. And by the way, Nick Begich was the deciding vote for it, and he voted against continuing tech-neutral tax credits for technologies like hydro, wind, and solar. So there's a range of policies that this bill would attack. I'll give you another one. This bill attempts to block states from implementing any regulation over artificial intelligence. What are the implications of that? We've got a pending bill, which came out of legislation sponsored by Mike Cronk, a very conservative Republican from the Interior, that would prohibit election deepfakes. This bill would say that we as state policymakers can do nothing to prevent Russia or any other foreign actor from interfering with our elections.
And because it is this enormous omnibus bill with lots of things thrown into it, it's really impossible for a single person to digest the entire bill. So I guess like the current status is that this bill passed the House barely.
By a single vote, Nick Begich's vote.
And it is now in the Senate where they are making changes. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, wants it on President Trump's desk by July 4th. So that's right. The timeline we're talking about.
Yeah, they're trying to fast track it before people understand it. Because if the Senate accepted 1/6 of the absolutely insane policies in this bill, it would be the worst federal bill ever passed for the state of Alaska.
The idea that now is the time for big tax cuts is historically not true in our country. We do tax cuts to incentivize the economy at times of recession. And that's not currently true. We have historically low unemployment. We are doing very well. We've more than fully recovered from COVID. Actually, if we look at the history, Reagan had tax cuts early in his administration, but towards the end of his administration, when the economy was doing well, he raised taxes. Clinton cut spending and raised taxes so that our deficit was lower at the end of his presidency. And when Clinton left office, the federal deficit was about 30% of GDP. Our deficit now is 100% of GDP and likely will increase well beyond that, even if this bill didn't pass. The idea that now is the time to grow the deficit at a faster rate just doesn't historically fit with the way even other Republican presidents have managed our economy.
This bill would increase the federal debt by $5 trillion. There's a good article by Ezra Klein in the New York Times, Trump's big budget bomb, which explains that none of this investment will create more manufacturing, build out infrastructure. You can make an argument that it could, under certain circumstances, be worth taking on more debt to build up our defense capacity in an increasingly hostile world. This bill does none of that. This bill will actually significantly undermine our ability to produce energy. It'll significantly undermine domestic manufacturing and benefit rich people, many of whom don't even live here. We legislate downstream of federal policy. If the federal government is creating an investment environment that is conducive to develop energy sources across Alaska, we have an opportunity to expand and capitalize on that as state policymakers. If federal policy is generally making healthcare more affordable and accessible, we can expand those opportunities at the state level. Conversely, if the federal government is shifting hundreds of millions of dollars of costs onto us as a state, it will blow up our budget and make it impossible for us to make progress. If the federal government, with this budget reconciliation bill, which has passed the House and now is in the Senate, is taking away health coverage from tens of thousands of Alaskans and shifting costs onto the state, then there is nothing that we can do to preserve your health coverage. And because this federal bill will blow up our state budget, there is no way we can sustain funding for basic public services. By the way, this federal bill is cutting about a third of SNAP food assistance funding. Tens of thousands of Alaskans will be hungry as a result of this bill. And then you have to ask yourself, what is the point of this budget reconciliation bill being pushed by Washington, D.C. extremists? It's to cut taxes for the richest people. This bill would add $1.1 trillion to the federal deficit to cut taxes for the ultra rich, and it would cut $1.1 trillion from food and Medicaid coverage. To say that this bill is a moral abomination would be a gross understatement. It is utterly unprecedented in the history of our nation in terms of an assault on hungry children to finance tax cuts for the very wealthiest people. The $1.1 trillion in tax cuts for the ultra wealthy that I reference is for people making more than $500,000 per year. That's just one category of tax cuts for the ultra wealthy.
Let's talk about Medicaid and the cuts to Medicaid. A lie that has been told by the president is that it's only eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, that it's not eliminating anything meaningful from Medicaid. But that has been fact-checked, and that is definitely not true.
Yeah, what this bill does, Republicans in D.C. understand that if they were just honest and said, hey, we just want to take away your health coverage to finance tax cuts for the rich, people would not be okay with that. So instead, what D.C. Republicans have done is say, oh, this is a work requirement. The only thing is, to show that you're doing this work, you have to go through a maze of paperwork and red tape. And that maze will be so lengthy, dark, and difficult to navigate that no, you won't keep your Medicaid coverage. So they've intentionally created the most bureaucratic process to maintain a benefit that people are supposed to be eligible for under current law. Now you might ask yourself, I thought we were supposed to be cutting red tape, making the government more efficient. The budget reconciliation bill before Congress makes Medicaid as bureaucratic, as cumbersome as possible to force people out of their health care to, quote, save money. But here's the thing. It doesn't save money. Because when you take away people's primary care, guess when they go to the hospital? When they go into the ER. That is the most expensive way to provide healthcare. Work requirements literally cannot be implemented in the state of Alaska. They would be implemented by the same people who verify SNAP eligibility, where they have a 61% error rate. The worst in the country by orders of magnitude. So under the design of this budget reconciliation bill, Alaska would be punished worse than any other state in terms of validating Medicaid eligibility. And again, what is the benefit of intentionally churning people out of Medicaid when we know they're going to go to the ER?
100%.
And for the last decade, the state and federal government have actually been working together to make the healthcare system more affordable. It's been a bipartisan effort. Pete Kelly passed the bill a decade ago to reform Medicaid. There have been corresponding federal efforts. Our system is more efficient today. We've covered 73,000 additional Alaskans. How many more state dollars do we spend on Medicaid a decade later? Zero. We spend zero additional dollars and we insure 73,000 more people. If this federal bill passes, it will shift approximately $260 million from the federal government onto the state and cancel health coverage for tens of thousands of Alaskans. We should break down who are the Alaskans who are vulnerable to their health care being cut off. Number one, not in Medicaid, but a group of people who work in the private sector and buy their health insurance through the exchange through what are called enhanced premium tax credits. This bill eliminates enhanced premium tax credits. Why is that a big deal for Alaska? Because if you're an employee of a small business, if you're an owner of a small business, you have a huge interest in a functioning healthcare exchange because in our tiny insurance market, health insurance is simply unaffordable for most people. Without the enhanced premium tax credits, you will see people have to quit their job in order to get healthcare through Medicaid. It's kind of ironic, right? Now, that's about 23,000 Alaskans who will be at risk. Those Alaskans get their healthcare through the enhanced premium tax credits. The other giant group is the 50,000 plus Alaskans who are in what's called the Medicaid expansion population. These are single adults who finally brought primary care to bring down costs within the overall system. The expansion population is the target of these work requirements. The reality is the vast majority of people on Medicaid expansion are already working. So why do these crazy DC Republicans want to impose work requirements? To force people off of healthcare. What's going to be the impact of that? It's very simple. More criminals roaming the street because they're addicted to drugs and can't get treatment. More untreated psychiatric patients, again, roaming around, unhoused, making it impossible for our state to do business.
Yeah, it's interesting that work requirement. I did do a little research this morning, and there are some states that piloted work requirements for Medicaid. They would be to incentivize people who are able to work to get jobs. But what they found is that did not happen. It did not incentivize people to work jobs. Right now, nationwide, 64% of Medicaid recipients work. So a significant majority of people receiving Medicaid are already working. And the idea that you're going to deny someone health care in order to incentivize them to work in that 36% of folks who don't have jobs, what they learned in those pilot programs is that this was not the way to do it, that this did not incentivize working. If that's what their goal is, it doesn't work. There are people out there who will put the talking points out there like, we don't want to have a bunch of freeloaders. The majority of people on Medicaid are not freeloading for healthcare.
Almost half of people on Medicaid are kids. That's 30 or 40% in Alaska. For people who want to look at Medicaid work requirements, the state of Georgia piloted it. The state of Georgia spent more on administration of work requirements than on actual healthcare. So yes, if you want to spend more money on bureaucracy than healthcare itself, impose work requirements.
I think something else about Medicaid that was interesting, and this is from Edwin Park, a professor at Georgetown University, who focuses on Medicaid and CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. He said that when they claim that their Medicaid cuts would eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, that's a very tiny minority of the cut. It would increase assessments to make sure that beneficiaries are not deceased. That makes sense. We shouldn't be paying Medicaid for people who are deceased. But the vast majority of the provisions fit into other categories. They eliminate Medicaid expansion. They eliminate states' abilities to finance Medicaid themselves. Why would the federal government say that states are not allowed to spend their own money on Medicaid? It imposes additional red tape on beneficiaries. It rolls back protections against medical debt. It forces states to drop coverage, even if the state would choose to fill the gap. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would they do this?
Because there is a group of people in DC who have a very reactionary vision for the country in which it is acceptable to take away the working poor's health coverage to finance tax cuts for the elite. And I don't think people understand how focused a large group of Republican senators are in getting this bill passed, come hell or high water. The important thing when it comes to Medicaid is Dan Sullivan's the deciding vote. Lisa Murkowski has said she doesn't support Medicaid cuts. Susan Collins has said she doesn't support Medicaid cuts. And Josh Hawley has been extremely vocal. Josh Hawley is a senator from Missouri campaigning against Medicaid cuts. Dan Sullivan is the fourth one. for people opposing Medicaid cuts means Medicaid does not get eviscerated. So it's really up to Dan Sullivan. Are we going to take away working class people's health coverage to finance tax cuts for billionaires? That's the question. And Dan Sullivan is the deciding vote.
Another point that Speaker of the House Mike Johnson has made is that they would eliminate 1.4 million unauthorized immigrants who are enrolled in Medicaid. The truth is that unauthorized immigrants are not eligible for federally funded Medicaid.
This is something that Nick Begich lied about when he came to the legislature. And I found it really offensive that he would come into the legislature and stand there in legislative chambers and lie about immigrants and Medicaid. He knows it's not true. Stop lying to Alaskans.
States are required to verify immigration status to determine eligibility. There are 14 states and the District of Columbia that use their own funds to provide insurance for undocumented immigrant children, and it's funded by the states alone. The House bill would penalize those states and reduce their overall funding even more if they continue to provide health insurance to undocumented children in our country. It doesn't make sense because, as you've already pointed out, it doesn't mean that these people aren't going to go to the hospital. We have EMTALA laws. That means when you arrive in an emergency department, you must be treated regardless of your ability to pay. When you arrive in an emergency department, you are going to receive treatment whether or not you have insurance or Medicaid or not. And they don't ask what your citizenship status is. They're going to do what's best to save the patient, and then there's going to be a bill at the end. And if there's no insurance, if there's no Medicaid, who pays? They send it to an address of somebody making minimum wage. They're not going to pay. Ultimately, we will pay.
Yeah, this is called uncompensated care. When an uninsured person goes to the emergency room because they didn't have primary care and they get the most expensive, least efficient form of healthcare, who pays? The largest health insurance program is the state of Alaska, and the state of Alaska is Alaska Care. So this federal budget reconciliation bill will directly pass on costs to the state of about $260 million. And put that in context, that's about a 40% cut to the permanent fund dividend. But that's before the indirect costs in terms of uncompensated care. So when an uninsured person goes to the hospital and gets care, the uncompensated care costs get passed on to Alaska Care. That translates into reductions in the PFD, reductions in services, reductions in school funding. But the other group of employers who gets passed on to are oil companies, contractors, and healthcare providers, some of the largest employers in the state of Alaska. Rather than getting a raise, someone who works for an oil company, a contractor, a healthcare employer is going to be paying more money in their health insurance premiums. Because when there's uncompensated care, healthcare facilities, those that can stay open, and if this bill passes, I can guarantee you there will be healthcare facilities that close. Those that are able to stay open will, out of necessity, pass on those costs to the insured population, which will make Alaska a less competitive place to live and work and a less competitive place to invest. And that is the tragedy of this bill, is that, yeah, it's really cruel to kick children off of healthcare. It's really cruel to kick working poor families off of healthcare. But it's really stupid to make it more expensive for our private sector to provide health insurance.
We've been debating going on forever about how are we going to fund public education in Alaska. One of the biggest costs to public education in Alaska is health insurance premiums, which go up, not down. Cuts like this drive those premiums even higher, which ultimately means that we're cutting the funding to our public education. When a higher percentage of money is going to pay for those health insurance costs, there's less money going into the classroom. Supporting federal policy like this ensures that less money goes into the classroom.
I think the proposed Medicaid cuts are particularly infuriating because over the last decade, we've made progress as a country. More people are insured, and the rate of growth of health insurance has fallen to the rate of inflation. These savings are significant. Simply cutting the growth and the cost of healthcare means that Medicare is not at risk of running out of money anymore. Medicare is solvent. We've had success by extending coverage because it's more efficient to provide primary care rather than let people go to the emergency room when they're about to die. This bill would erase more than a decade of progress and the work of literally tens of thousands of people across state, federal governments, and a wide range of healthcare systems across the country. And why? Because these radical people in DC hate a functioning healthcare system. They don't want people to have health coverage, and they want to finance tax cuts for the ultra wealthy. That is insane policy.
I can speak more about this just as a healthcare provider in Anchorage at an urgent care. So most people in their 60s or 70s that have chronic health conditions, and they're going to have high blood pressure and diabetes, not severe type 2 diabetes where they're on insulin, but diabetes that's well controlled with oral medication. There's a lot of generics that are very cheap. The medications themselves are not a barrier to treatment. The barrier to treatment is getting someone to prescribe them to you. If you show up at an urgent care in Anchorage and you do not have any health insurance and you're going to pay cash, if the provider underbills for your visit, means it says that this was a very routine visit, it's going to be about $200 cash. It's $200 cash to get access to very cheap medications that prevent severe health consequences that could lead to the amputation of your legs, blindness, a stroke, with severe deficits. Cost of prevention is so low, and yet we are moving along a trajectory that means that folks who would take their very cheap medication cannot get them.
Yeah, so the state of Alaska has studied Medicaid enrollment. It is cheaper for people in Alaska to stay on Medicaid and have coverage than it is to disenroll and re-enroll them. So we have better health outcomes and we save money. So this idea that we have to be cruel to people to save money is not true. And that's why I say the radicals in DC who are pushing this bill have an ideological goal of getting rid of health coverage for the working poor because they don't like government programs that work.
This isn't probably where you were going, but I will go there because we've heard it said out loud before. Basically, a quote from the Bible that Jesus said the poor would always be with us. And therefore, they believe there's sort of a biblical justification for not trying to eliminate poverty. If Jesus has said they will always be with us, a very specific interpretation would say that it would be against the will of God to try to eliminate poverty.
Yeah, that quote would be willfully ignoring all the other teachings of Jesus that encourage us to take care of one another. But the broader point for me is, yes, it is cruel to take away the working poor's health coverage. It's ultimately self-defeating, whether you're poor, middle class, or very wealthy, because there is no benefit to our economy from disenrolling people and making our economy less competitive. We haven't talked that much about the energy provisions. This budget reconciliation bill will make it impossible to achieve energy independence in Alaska. Wind, solar, hydro in rural communities of the rail belt, not going to happen. This bill. We will forever remain dependent on imported LNG in the rail belt and imported diesel in rural Alaska. Why on earth would we do that to ourselves?
I'm glad you brought that up because when I interviewed Bronson Fry at the end of December, he talked about the $1 billion in Alaskan infrastructure projects that would be happening over the next decade. His folks are flying high. And I remember saying, I was like, you sure all that's going to happen? And he was like, why would it not? Like, under what circumstance would the federal government not want those infrastructure projects to move forward? So I'm just wondering, are you able to comment on what is the state of the infrastructure projects that were promised under the Biden administration in Alaska?
Stepping back, the manufacturing sector in America grew for the first time under Joe Biden and a bipartisan Congress in my lifetime in the last 4 decades. Since Trump took office, it has cratered because of unpredictability around tariffs primarily, but also because of DC Republicans attacking energy tax incentives. A lot of these manufacturing facilities in the lower 48 are about batteries and cars and those kinds of things. Where we see the impact in Alaska is really around energy generation, storage, transmission. The Bipartisan Policy Center has a really good analysis of energy provisions in this bill, and I'm just going to go through a few. This bill phases out the advanced manufacturing tax credit early. It eliminates domestic vehicle manufacturing incentives. It eliminates tech-neutral tax credits that facilitate the construction of everything from nuclear to solar to wind to geothermal. So literally all the technologies that we need for energy independence in the rail belt and our rural communities are gone. And it also restricts some of the carbon dioxide sequestration credits, and it does so in a backdoor way. It prohibits, quote, foreign influence entities. What does that really mean? You have any investment from a company that has some foreign share of ownership, which is every company. Why would we be doing this? There's a coal plant proposal, which I don't think is going to happen, but the proposal would sequester carbon dioxide. So this would get in the way. The only reason you would pass these incentives is if you want to inhibit U.S. energy production. That's the fascinating thing to me about this bill is wonderful for China if you want U.S. manufacturing and energy production to retreat and China to just have complete dominance in the world in terms of advanced energy production, vehicle and battery manufacturing. The U.S. is going to lose. Alaska, you could say, is collateral damage in that process. A Chinese foreign agent couldn't have done a better job writing a bill to disempower America than the budget reconciliation bill that passed the House.
What we need is for Dan Sullivan to vote no, or I guess, are they to be coming forward as amendments? Is that what's going to be happening now?
Number one, they're going to write it behind closed doors. The Senate leadership will write something behind closed doors. So there's the opportunity for people like Sullivan, if they care, to say, no, I'm not cutting Medicaid. No, I'm not eliminating tech neutral tax credits. They're essential for affordable energy, whether we're talking about Quinnipiac or the rail belt.
So basically, he needs to hear from Alaskans now.
Yeah, you can do that behind closed doors initially, and then there will be votes on the floor on Medicaid, energy production tax credits, and we'll see where the votes are.
If the bill that goes to the floor has a lot of these terrible things in it that we've talked about, what happens if the Senate fails to pass it?
They will ultimately pass a budget reconciliation bill because this is the only way that a very broken DC can pass legislation. So they will pass something, but if you're not trying to finance trillions of dollars of tax cuts for ultra wealthy people, if all you want to do is just pass a reasonable budget, then no, you don't have to kick a bunch of Alaskans off of healthcare. And no, you don't have to kneecap our communities that are trying to build out energy generation.
But again, nuts and bolts. Let's say that the Medicaid funding has been largely restored, thanks to folks calling Dan Sullivan's office. He's the deciding vote. He's helping to make sure that Medicaid is kept. And then it goes back to the House for concurrence. So we need Nick Begich to concur.
And at the end of the day, the House will concur with whatever the Senate passes because they have to.
Okay.
Now, I guess it is also true that the Senate could just not pass a reconciliation bill at all and just do continuing resolutions for the remainder of the Trump administration. That is also a possibility, but I think there will be enough motivation they pass some form of budget reconciliation. The important thing to remember is there's no reason to cut Medicaid. There just isn't. There's no reason to kneecap domestic energy producers. So why do that? People should just understand the gravity of the threat that Alaska faces.
Zack Fields, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.